ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that the madness unfolding after Marco's death is no longer just a murder mystery circling Port Charles. It is turning into something darker, more personal, and far more dangerous because the death itself is beginning to feel less like an ending and more like the ignition point of a vicious new war. What makes it even more explosive is the possibility that Marco understood the truth before his final breath, that he knew Cullum wanted him dead, that he knew the murder would not simply erase him but would be weaponized to bury someone else. Jason was always the perfect target, the perfect name to drag through blood and suspicion, the perfect man to turn into a hunted shadow, while the real architect of destruction stood back and watched the city tear itself apart. And if Marco realized that, if he saw the trap closing around him with enough clarity to act before he died, then the secret letter he sent to Britt becomes more than evidence. It becomes the one buried spark that could set every lie on fire. Britt does not receive that letter as a passive witness to tragedy. She receives it like a wound reopening inside her chest, because the moment she understands what Marco may have been trying to tell her, everything changes. The fear is no longer abstract. The danger is no longer distant. Jason is not simply entangled in another crisis. He is being methodically cornered, pushed into the exact position Cullum designed for him. The longer Jason remains under pursuit from the PCPD, the easier it becomes for rumor to harden into belief, for manipulated evidence to become accepted truth, and for every door around him to begin closing one by one. Britt understands this with brutal clarity, and that knowledge forces her into a state of relentless urgency. She has no luxury left for hesitation, no emotional shelter left to hide inside. Marco's death becomes a countdown, and every second she wastes could be another second Jason sinks deeper into a trap that was built long before he even knew he was standing on unstable ground. What makes the situation even more suffocating is that Britt cannot move openly. She is not operating in a world where truth is enough to save anyone. She is operating in a world where truth has to survive long enough to be believed, and that is a far more difficult battle. The letter itself is dangerous, but so is everyone who might learn that it exists. Britt begins to see threat everywhere, not because she is paranoid, but because paranoia has become the only rational response. If Cullum killed Marco to bury what he knew, then Cullum would never allow the dead man's final words to surface without a fight. That means Britt is no longer just carrying information. She is carrying a motive for someone else to silence her too. This is where the story turns crueler, because Britt's determination to save Jason is tangled with everything unresolved between them. Her need to protect him is not simple loyalty and not some neat, heroic instinct. It is heavier than that, messier than that. Jason has always been the kind of man who draws danger toward himself as if sacrifice were the only language he truly trusted. Britt knows that pattern, knows how often he steps into fire because he believes he can contain the damage alone. But now she is forced to confront a truth that enrages her as much as it breaks her heart. Jason may still try to shield everyone else by staying silent, by running, by taking the weight of suspicion onto his own shoulders if he thinks it will spare others. That instinct, once something she may have admired in its grim strength, now feels almost unbearable, because in this moment, silence is not noble. Silence is exactly what Cullum needs. Silence is the weapon, turning Marco's death into Jason's ruin. As Jason stays one step ahead of the PCPD, pressure mounts from every direction. The pursuit itself begins to alter him. He is used to danger, used to being hunted, used to surviving in narrow spaces with almost no margin for error. But this is different because it is not only his life at risk, his name is being slowly reshaped into a narrative he did not write. That kind of attack has its own violence. The city begins to look at him through the eyes of the accusation, and even those who know him best feel the tension creeping in. Every alley becomes a calculation, every familiar place becomes compromised, every ally becomes someone he might endanger by staying too close. The isolation begins doing its work, and that isolation is exactly what Cullum wants. A cornered Jason is easier to control than a supported one. A desperate Jason is easier to provoke into one mistake that will make the lie permanent. Meanwhile, Britt is pushed into a cruel balancing act between logic and emotion. She knows the letter could expose everything, but she also knows that moving too soon could get Jason killed before the truth ever comes out. She starts tracing Marco's final steps in her mind, reconstructing his fear, his urgency, and the possibility that he knew he was already marked for death. The more she thinks about it, the more furious she becomes. Marco did not just die, he was turned into a message. His death was arranged to destabilize, to redirect suspicion, to ignite a chain reaction of panic and blame. Britt cannot ignore how monstrous that is. Cullum did not merely remove an obstacle, he used a man's final moments to create a larger architecture of terror. That realization hardens something inside her. Grief gives way to anger, and anger gives way to purpose. Still, purpose does not erase vulnerability. Britt knows she is being watched even when she cannot prove it. Strange movements, interrupted routines, missing seconds in which rooms feel touched by another presence, all of it begins to close in on her nerves. She starts to understand that the letter is not the only key to the truth. Her own behavior is becoming evidence to the wrong people that she knows too much. This forces her into increasingly dangerous choices. She cannot trust the obvious routes. She cannot simply go to the authorities, not when Jason is already the target and not when the machinery of blame is already in motion. She begins hiding pieces of information in different places, thinking several moves ahead, almost against her own will, transforming into someone colder, sharper, more strategic. The emotional cost of that change is enormous. She hates what this situation is making her become, yet she hates even more the idea of doing nothing while Jason is sacrificed. The cruelty of the situation deepens when Britt realizes that saving Jason may require hurting him first. If he discovers she is moving behind his back, withholding details, setting traps, and manipulating the timing of what she reveals, he may see it as betrayal. But from her perspective, hesitation is death. She no longer has the luxury of being understood. She only has the duty to act. That internal fracture becomes one of the most painful aspects of the story. She is fighting for Jason, but to do it, she may have to deceive him, provoke him, even push him into actions he would never willingly choose. Love and strategy begin to bleed into each other until neither feels clean anymore. In that collision lies the true emotional violence of the story. The people trying to save each other are being twisted into versions of themselves they barely recognize. Jason, for his part, is driven by a rage he keeps locked down with discipline. But that rage is growing more unstable with every passing hour. He knows he is being maneuvered. He knows Marco's death was meant to trigger something bigger. And he knows that if Britt is now involved, the threat has spread into territory he cannot control. That is what tears at him the most. Jason can endure pursuit, injury, and accusation. What he cannot tolerate is the idea that someone he cares about is being dragged into the blast radius because of him. That guilt begins to sharpen his decisions. He becomes harsher, more impulsive in private, more willing to risk himself to cut through the lie at its source. Yet, that instinct is dangerous because it plays directly into Cullum's hands. The more Jason acts from fury, the easier it becomes to paint him as exactly what the city is being told he is. Cullum, meanwhile, thrives in the widening chaos. He is not simply covering up a murder, he is engineering emotional collapse around it. He understands how fear distorts loyalty, how grief weakens judgment, how law enforcement pressure can be used as psychological warfare. By framing Jason, he is doing more than removing suspicion from himself. He is attacking the one man whose instinct is always to protect others, and he is doing it in a way that forces everyone around Jason into terrible choices. That is the real elegance of Cullum's cruelty. He does not need to destroy people directly if he can make them destroy each other through mistrust, desperation, and fractured timing. As Britt digs deeper into the implications of Marco's letter, she may uncover that Marco anticipated not just his own death, but the chain of consequences that would follow. That possibility makes the letter feel almost ghostly, as though Marco reached beyond his death to place one final weapon in the hands of the only person he believed might use it wisely. The burden of that faith crushes Britt, even as it empowers her. She cannot fail, because failure would mean Marco died knowing the truth and still lost everything. It would mean Jason becomes the next casualty in a plan designed by someone too arrogant to imagine being exposed. And so the story races forward under the weight of panic, vengeance, and impossible decisions. Britt moves faster than ever before, driven by fear, grief, and a stubborn refusal to let Jason be buried under a crime he did not commit. Jason fights both the law and the invisible architecture of a setup designed to isolate him. The PCPD closes in, suspicion spreads, and every small mistake threatens to become fatal. The secret letter becomes the center of a silent storm, a single piece of truth powerful enough to destroy Cullum's scheme, yet dangerous enough to get anyone near it killed. Marco's death does not fade into the background. It becomes the poison in every conversation, the tension in every movement, the fury behind every choice. By the time the truth begins to surface, none of these people will emerge untouched. Britt will have crossed lines she once believed she would never cross. Jason will have been forced to face how vulnerable even he can become when the attack is not only on his body but on his identity. And Cullum, in trying to write the story of Marco's death to his own advantage, may have created the very storm that will consume him. Because the one thing more dangerous than a man like Jason being hunted is a woman like Britt being given a reason to stop being afraid. In Port Charles, grief never stays buried for long. It mutates. It sharpens. It comes back wearing anger, strategy, and the raw need to make someone pay. Britt could feel the walls closing in long before anyone else admitted how dangerous the situation had become. What started as fear over Marco's death was no longer just grief or suspicion. It had turned into something darker, something that followed her through every hallway, every late-night thought, every moment of silence, when she realized Jason's name was being dragged deeper into a trap that had been carefully prepared for him. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that staying in Port Charles was no longer an option for him. This city had become poisoned. Every street carried accusation, every familiar face seemed tied to a question, and every hour Jason remained there gave his enemies more time to tighten the noose around him. That was what haunted Britt the most. Jason was still trying to endure it, still trying to stay close enough to the truth to uncover what really happened to Marco, but Britt could already see the cost. He was being hunted not only by the PCPD, but by rumor, by manipulation, and by the carefully planted belief that he had far more to do with Marco's death than anyone could prove. Britt understood something Jason refused to accept. Truth did not always win quickly, and in Port Charles, truth often arrived only after lives had already been destroyed. If Jason stayed, he might never get the chance to clear his name. He might be arrested, cornered, or pushed into making one desperate move that would only confirm everyone's worst suspicions. That fear hardened into resolve. Britt no longer wanted to simply protect Jason from one immediate threat. She wanted to take him out of the entire battlefield. She wanted him gone before Port Charles swallowed him whole. But the cruelest part was that leaving would not be simple. Jason was not the kind of man who ran easily, especially not when a dead man's secrets were still waiting to be uncovered. Marco's death was already beginning to erupt beneath the surface, and Britt knew that if they disappeared now, the truth might be buried forever. Yet if they stayed, the truth might come out too late to save him. That impossible choice tore at her. On one side was survival, on the other was justice, and both paths carried the threat of ruin. Britt began to understand that Marco's death had not just triggered an investigation, it had detonated a chain reaction of secrets that were always going to explode. The lies surrounding his final hours were too carefully arranged, too deliberate, too cruel to remain hidden forever. Someone had wanted Marco dead, but even worse, someone had wanted his death to become a weapon. Jason was the target left standing in the blast zone. As Britt moved closer to Jason, her desperation sharpened. She did not want to lose more time to hesitation or pride. She wanted action. She wanted movement. She wanted to grab what little control they had left and force a new direction before the city made the decision for them. In her mind, escape was no longer weakness, it was strategy. It was the only way to make sure Jason lived long enough to fight back. But even as she imagined getting him out of Port Charles, she knew the secrets tied to Marco's death would not stay buried behind them. They would follow, they would grow louder, and the further Jason got from the city, the more frightened his enemies might become. That was the true danger now. If Britt helped Jason leave, panic would spread among the people who needed him trapped. Those hidden truths would begin to crack open under pressure. Marco's death would stop looking like a closed tragedy and start looking like the beginning of a conspiracy far uglier than anyone wanted to admit. Britt could sense it already, the coming explosion, the unraveling of carefully guarded lies, the rage that would erupt when people realized Jason might have been hunted to protect the real monster behind Marco's final moments. So Britt stood at the edge of a terrible decision, driven by fear, anger, and something deeper she could no longer deny. She wanted Jason alive more than she wanted anyone's approval, more than she wanted the city's version of justice, more than she wanted safety for herself. If Port Charles had become a graveyard of secrets, then she was ready to tear Jason away from it before he became one more name lost to betrayal. And if Marco's death had truly planted the seeds of a coming war, then Britt knew one thing with painful clarity. The moment she chose Jason over the city, nothing in Port Charles would remain quiet for long.